On the line with us, my old buddy Lamar Waldron. We worked together on a couple of books, Legacy of Secrecy, The Long Shot of the JFK Assassination, and Robert Kennedy, National Security, the Mafia, and the Assassination of Martin Luther King, and Ultimate Sacrifice, which was about the JFK assassination. Lamar is the author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination and Watergate, The Hidden History, which we're going to get into in just a minute. The question, will Trump and Barr go down like Nixon and his Attorney General John Mitchell, who spent 19 months in prison? So my old friend and collaborator, Lamar Waldron, welcome back, Lamar.
Great to be with you again, Tom.
Thanks.
I just can't believe how much news has been coming out today and yesterday and everything, but it's just like the old Nixon Watergate days when it's, you know, if we think these have been heavy news days for the past couple of weeks, you know, put on your seatbelt, because the next week, the next month, frankly, the next year is going to be more of the same.
Yeah, and they just busted two of Rudy Giuliani's buddies who were born in Ukraine. They were at Dulles trying to flee the country, and apparently what these guys were doing was trying to bribe Congressman Pete Sessions to get the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine fired on behalf of some Ukrainian oligarchs. I mean, it's insane. But in the meantime, people are. BBC is reporting 60,000 people are fleeing Kurds from their territory in northern Syria in the face of this invasion from Turkey. I mean, you know, this is terrible, terrible stuff that Donald Trump would turn his back on our allies, on the Kurds. It turns out they actually did fight with us in World War II, not as a nation, but you know, there was this it was called the Iraqi or the Iraq group or something like that, and it was made up of 5 different ethnic groups who make up that coalition right now, but principally the Kurds. They fought on our behalf in World War II, and I understand from you, Lamar, that Trump is not the first Republican president to screw the Kurds.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, this has been going on since the days of Nixon. And I'd like to just kind of briefly go back in time, starting with right now, because the other big thing is, why is Trump doing this now when it seems like, he needs all of his Republican supporters, and now he's angering them. But as your listeners will learn over the next hour, there's usually never like one reason Trump is doing things. There are always several sleazy reasons that all come together, because in this case, you've got his numerous business ties, more than 100 business ties to Turkey, including the big Trump towers, not just one tower, but 2. You've got Turkey and whatever they know about Khashoggi's murder. The American Saudi journalist who was murdered in Turkey. And there was a lot of credible reporting at the time that his body was even disposed of in Turkey. So whether that's true or not, Turkey knows a lot about Khashoggi's murder. And so that's pressure and leverage that they have on Trump. But most importantly, and again, this will be a recurring theme throughout the hour, is Trump and Putin. I mean, basically, Trump is giving Syria to Putin and Turkey, just like the Germans and Russia carved up Poland at the start of World War II.
But yet, Turkey is part of NATO and wants to be part of the European Union. How does that, there's an obvious conflict between that and being in bed with Putin's Russia.
Well, again, though, you've got a guy who's essentially an elected dictator. And, of course, we should all remember a lot of dictators, like Adolf Hitler, were elected. But so, in other words, it's whatever Erdogan wants to stay in power. That's what's important, not Turkey as a nation,
right.
Not what's good for the Turkish people,
yeah.
Just like with Trump. And that's one reason I think Trump and Erdogan get along as well as they relatively do. But the other big thing, the other big gift to Putin in all this is the open skies policy. That's been, just a tiny little footnote
Explain
in most
that.
reports. Well, that basically says, you remember the old days in the 60s when we'd read about the U-2 spy planes and Russia shot down one? Well, to, in the sense of ending the Cold War, we have this open skies policy that says basically, we can fly surveillance planes over Russia, and Russia can fly surveillance planes over us. In other words, we're not going to do anything, hopefully, that treaties don't allow, and we expect Russia to be the same way. Well, now Trump, I think, is taking advantage of all this horrible publicity about our Kurdish allies starting to be slaughtered, and that he just they're gonna end this open skies policy, which it's just a total incomplete gift to Putin, one of many that Trump keeps giving. So again, like I say, there's a lot of reasons this is happening now, and this is the fourth time a Republican president has betrayed our Kurdish allies. The first time is back in not the first time, the third time was back in 1991 under President George Bush Sr. after the first Iraq War, when, if I'm sure you recall, Bush Sr. urged the Kurds to rise up against Saddam, whom
Yes.
Bush, because the Saudis didn't want him to, had not actually deposed Saddam after we spent all the money and lives to invade Iraq that first time. Only, once Bush got the Kurds whipped up to rebel against Saddam and hopefully overthrow him, then he wouldn't support them, and they were slaughtered. And that's purely on Republican President Bush Sr.
And there were mass graves. I mean, this was like on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of people who were slaughtered, was it not?
And it was a huge thing, but even that, like I say, that was the third time, just 3 years earlier, under the Reagan-Bush administration, and I almost hesitate to say Reagan-Bush because by that time, I think it was mostly the Bush administration in waiting, because Reagan, was starting to have his Alzheimer's and memory problems. On March 16th, 1988, over 3,000 Kurds were killed, over 7,000 were injured with poison gas, the kind of large-scale poison gas attack that I don't think has been seen since, World War I, maybe?
Yeah, and it was outlawed by international convention after World War I because of the horrors of the poison gas attacks.
And yet, and that was all at the same time Iran-Contra was unraveling, and you had Edwin Meese, the Reagan Attorney General, was involved with all these scandals and everything. But, there are even indications, and you may know more about this than I, that Donald Rumsfeld and the Reagan-Bush administration actually had some sort of role in the lead up to that gas attack.
Well, there's a famous photograph of Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and it was from the trip where he went over there on behalf of the Reagan administration to sell Saddam Hussein weapons. And apparently, this came out, when Bush Jr. was trying to sell us on a war with Saddam. It came out that among the things that he was selling them were at least the precursor chemicals to make these poison gases.
And so it's just horrible what keeps happening. But now let's dial back to the first time that our Kurdish allies were betrayed by a Republican president, and that's all started under President Nixon. And this is in the early 1970s, and he's got his horrible national security advisor, Secretary of State guy, Henry Kissinger, who I'm not even sure. Kissinger may or may not be under indictment in some countries today for some of the stuff Kissinger did back then. I believe there are countries that Kissinger may not be able to travel to because he would be arrested. And so, under the Nixon administration, Nixon himself, and we'll get to all the parallels between he and Trump shortly, but basically at that time, we were against Iraq because of Saddam Hussein, but Nixon was good friends with Iran at that time. Younger people can't imagine a time when Iran was our second biggest ally in the entire Middle East after Israel.
Right, and this was because of the Shah, because we had placed this dictator there.
Exactly, that was funneling money to Nixon, and then Nixon set up this deal with the Kurds that wound up and them getting slaughtered back then, which I'll finish that and we'll get into some other stuff.
So the Shah was paying off Nixon under the table?
Oh, of course.
Amazing.
Well, so So the Shah of Iran was paying off Nixon from the 1968 election, again in the 1972 election. So we see that desire to get the help from foreign countries on the behalf of Nixon to win elections, and so what happened there was the Shah was against Iraq. Nixon and Kissinger funded the Kurds to kind of do actions against Iraq, but then the Shah, who was thoroughly corrupt, horrible, brutal dictator, cut a deal with the horrible, brutal dictator Saddam Hussein on the waterway that runs between those two countries that leads to the Strait of Hormuz and stuff. And once they had cut that deal, then the U.S. just ended the support for the Kurds after stirring them up against Saddam, and then, of course, Saddam is attacking them in retribution. So, I mean, it's almost shocking that the Kurds would ever believe what any American president, especially a Republican, says, but the mainstream media, goes out of their way not to point out that it's always been Republican presidents that do this. But again, to get back to Nixon and Trump, the Shah was not the only foreign dictator giving money to Nixon to help him win elections. There was the U.S.-backed junta in Greece. There was Marcos in the Philippines, and there was, of course, the dictator of South Vietnam, who basically through the peace deal that was supposed to occur in the fall of 1968, and that was just to help Nixon win the election. They extended the Vietnam War by another 2 or 3 years. So Nixon, like Trump, wanted both the foreign assistance to win elections in 68 and 72, but also just to literally pocket that money, because there's so many. I'm sorry, what was that again, Tom?
Does this have something to do with why there has not been a Democratic president who has betrayed the Kurds, but there's been a series of Republican ones that betraying the Kurds always involved a Republican president getting something, cash or campaign help, and the Democrats, by and large, are at least not that corrupt?
I would say,
or is it just an accident of history?
No, I don't think it's an accident. I mean, basically, Joe Biden is a little conservative for my taste in a lot of ways, but he really knocked it out of the park. I believe it was yesterday when he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Trump would do anything to win an election, and that's what's at the heart of all of this. Nixon, Reagan, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., Trump, they will do anything to win an election. Nixon will commit treason, and extend this Vietnam War at the cost of thousands of American lives, just to win an election. Reagan and Bush, with the whole October surprise thing, keeping our hostages in Iran and torpedoing that deal right before that election. And so, to me, that's what it is, and I think there is a lot to learn about Trump, though, when you look at everything that Nixon did to get elected and stay in office.
Lamar, you were talking about how Nixon was taking bribes from the Shah of Iran. He was enriching himself from foreign dictators. Trump is, in my opinion, in fact, frankly, I think that the reason why Donald Trump said to Erdogan, okay, fine, go ahead and slaughter the Kurds, was because Erdogan called him up and said, hey, you've got 119 different business interests in Turkey, not to mention Trump Tower. Erdogan threatened to take Trump's name off Trump Tower back when Trump had put Turkey on the list of Muslim states for his Muslim ban, and Trump jumped real quickly on that one. I think this is all about the money. Are there more parallels between Trump and Nixon in this regard, being willing to be bought off by foreigners?
It's just horrendous, and I think it's especially appropriate now that Trump is in re-election mode to look at all the things that Nixon was trying to do to get reelected, which, of course, he was. We hope Trump isn't. But, of course, Nixon, even after wide reporting on the Watergate break-ins and that it pretty clearly involved the White House, Nixon was reelected overwhelmingly. So let's go look. So Nixon, since the start of his political career, was using organized crime, money, and connections to help him in his elections, first to Congress, then the Senate. then, when he first tried to run for president against JFK, and then when he actually, finally won the presidency, and then when he was running again. And, of course, Trump has his organized crime ties going back to at least the 1980s, probably the 1970s. I mean, they both engage in massive money laundering. I mean, Richard Nixon at one time, with his money man, D.B. Rebozo, they actually bought a coin laundry to help launder their illicit money, but that was when they were doing things on a smaller scale, when he was vice president. Now Nixon, as president, was laundering his money in a much bigger way. But Trump, since the 1980s at least, has been laundering money. I've read that there were only 2 developers in New York City in the 80s that would sell an expensive condominium or co-op or building to a blind attorney, a blind trust, where you did not know who was actually buying it. Most developers wouldn't do that because they knew that was the mafia either laundering money or foreigners, and just starting in the late 1980s, to be Russians laundering money. And so, they have the money laundering in common. Nixon got so many bribes and payoffs, again, not just from foreign dictators, but literally from the mafia. Mm-hmm. And so, I think as things unfold, we're going to find more and more. Of course, organized crime today, as Hillary Clinton once didn't say but agreed with, Russia is basically a big organized crime state on a state level now. At this point, that's what they are. And so when you look at it that way, Trump is just getting all this money. They both had tax scams. Nixon's famous "I am not a crook" statement was not about Watergate. It was about his taxes. Mm. And, of course, once his tax scams were found out and he had to repay them with more illicit bribe money, that's when the tradition came about that every president's taxes get audited and everybody releases their taxes, which Trump won't do. I mean, they're both such experts at manipulating the mainstream media. I mean, Nixon, like I say, 5 months after the Watergate break-ins were in every newspaper in the country, Nixon gets reelected by a landslide because he knows how to manipulate the mainstream press. Trump seems like he has lost that touch within the last week or two, but I'm not sure that he won't regain that.
Oh, it'll come back. We have just a minute to the break. John Mitchell, Nixon's AG, Bill Barr, Trump's AG.
Well, they were just so, John Mitchell was basically a consigliere for Nixon. In other words, his job wasn't being Attorney General of the United States. It was being Nixon's fixer, basically. And in fact, he left the Attorney General position to become campaign manager, but he kept pretty much doing the same thing. And that's a huge similarity we see with Barr today. In other words, Barr is doing now for Trump exactly what he did for Bush Sr., where he's leading this re-election PR campaign in addition to doing all these political favors that in the case of Bush Sr. kept Bush Sr. from going to prison because Barr engineered those 5 pardons. And now it appears that Barr just has his fingers in every stinking pie that comes up in relation to all these impeachable offenses.
Do you think he could go down like John Mitchell did?
I certainly hope so, but there's some reasons that might not happen.
We've been talking about the parallels between Trump and Nixon and more recently, but in the larger context, 4 Republican presidents now have betrayed the Kurds since Richard Nixon began this whole song and dance. In every case, in exchange for money or political favors, this is just absolutely mind-boggling. Lamar, I don't know if you wanted to get into Paul Manafort in Ukraine, but do you see parallels now between what Trump and is doing, or what's happening in the United States with regard to our elections here, and what Paul Manafort was doing in 2010 in Ukraine?
Oh, they're tremendous parallels there. But before I dive into those, I did want to point out 2 more reasons, 2 more big parallels. One is stonewalling and obstruction by Nixon and by John Mitchell is what kept Nixon in office for more than 2 years after Watergate. The other thing that kept Nixon in office that I think bears repeating now is the way that Nixon and his Attorney General John Mitchell, and even after Mitchell was not Attorney General anymore, he was still Nixon's closest advisor, going after critics and whistleblowers and leakers. And under Nixon, that turned fatal at least twice. In other words, Nixon would try to unleash the IRS. He would have the FBI harass his critics. He would, go after them in the press. But in the case of America's most famous journalist, Jack Anderson, who had a string of exposés against Richard Nixon, Nixon, according to Mark Feldstein, professor at the University of Maryland, a former journalist, very distinguished, professor there. He wrote a great book, and it's pretty well documented that Richard Nixon ordered the White House plumbers, the people who were supposed to stop leaks, to assassinate Jack Anderson.
Wow.
In other words, Nixon literally gave that order. Apparently, as much as anyone can tell, the only reason Nixon did not succeed in that was that one of the Watergate plumbers, a guy whose real name was Frank Fiorini, but he had changed it from that Italian-sounding name, he was a mob associate, to Frank Sturgis. And Frank Sturgis was good friends with Jack Anderson from the days when Frank Sturgis was a soldier of fortune in the mountains of Cuba with Castro. So apparently that's the only reason that didn't happen. And then the other big leaker who started leaking after the White House plumbers were formed was Daniel Ellsberg. And again, just a month and a half before the final Watergate break-in, there were 4, not just one, Daniel Ellsberg was targeted to be, I'm paraphrasing here, he uses a more exact term, basically permanently silenced in a big demonstration in Washington. And Ellsberg, will always say that in any media appearance. I can always tell the journalists are skeptical that Nixon had actually ordered that Ellsberg be killed. But what the mainstream media doesn't ever talk about either, and what Ellsberg doesn't even know, is that 2 of the Watergate plumbers, Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker, were actively working for one of America's most ruthless godfathers at the time, Santo Trafficante, big supporter of Richard Nixon, gave Nixon lots of money, including contributed to 2 different $1 million bribes. And both Sturgis and Barker had successfully participated in assassinations in the past for the mafia and for the CIA. So I take Ellsberg very seriously. So that makes me worry about the current. I think we're up to at least 3 whistleblowers right now, and look at all the critics of Trump. And do I think William Barr would ever order a whistleblower killed? No, I don't. Has Trump threatened to have people killed in the past? There's reporting that he has. So I really worry about the safety of these whistleblowers. And I'll just say this before we move on to Ukraine. I am totally and completely confident that Donald Trump has been told the name of that first main whistleblower.
Yeah.
I based on everything I have read, everything I know.
And he's been whipping up this. So I don't know who it is. We need to find out who it is.
Exactly.
As a way of telegraphing to his more violent followers. Find and nail this guy. I'm not going to tell you who he is, but find and nail him.
And so I worry about all of that, which now brings us back to Ukraine, and the first time that Paul Manafort helped one of Putin's allies get elected president. This is back in 2010.
This is Yanukovych, right?
Yanukovych, exactly. And it's real important because most of your listeners are like me. 20 years ago, I knew nothing about Ukraine, but luckily I had a friend who did a great series of graphic novels about a young woman fighting in Ukraine, for Ukraine, in World War II. So he was going over to Ukraine, doing research, married a Ukrainian. So I was following Ukraine at a time, 10 years ago when most people weren't, because one of my best friends was over there all the time. And what's important to know, and what he always said, and the research bears it out, Ukraine, 60% of Ukraine, the middle and the western part of Ukraine, hate Russia. They hate Russia because going back to the 1930s, when Russia, under Stalin, grabbed Ukraine, and then to put down their resistance, he basically instituted this nationwide famine that killed millions of people. So, that has not been forgotten in Ukraine. Those people hate Russia, for what they did, for years when they were a satellite state, a captive state, but especially going back to 33. So 60% of Ukraine hates Russia. Now, what Stalin and later Khrushchev did, though, they had a lot of Russians move to the eastern part of Ukraine. So today, about 60% of Ukrainians hate Russia, and 40% of Ukrainians like Russia or actually are of Russian extraction. So
also in Crimea, Russia had that giant submarine base there, and that's where so many of the Russian military went there, served there, and then retired there because it's just absolutely beautiful territory and beautiful climate, and that kind of repopulated the local area.
And I would rather live in the Crimea 100 times more than any place, than Moscow,
Sure.
St. Petersburg. So, yes, that's
especially in the winter.
So the question is, how did Putin's ally get elected president of a country where 60% of the people hate anything to do with Russia? Well, the answer is Paul Manafort and some other political consultants who've done work for Trump. But Manafort was the main one, because what Manafort did, and remember, Manafort was a big part of Republican politics and elections going back to the late 70s here in America. Right. I mean, he
was huge with the Reagan campaign and the Bush campaign.
Exactly.
His partner Lee Atwater, his partner Roger Stone. These are legendary names in Republican politics.
And Roger Stone being the person that introduced Trump to to Richard Nixon, and Nixon said when he met Trump, basically said, I'm paraphrasing, you're going to be president someday.
Yeah.
So, so all these rats run together. So the way Manafort did that was apparently initially Yanukovych was too obviously pro-Russian, and he was kind of a rumpled Boris Johnson kind of guy. Basically, Paul Manafort cleaned up his act, in terms of, the suits, in terms of the hair, very Trump-like, and getting him to not, to play down and even just ignore or deny any pro-Russian bias, to talk about nationalism and all these, and mom and apple pie and
so Yanukovych did not run as a pro-Putin or pro-Russian candidate. He ran as basically Ukraine first.
And that is so important. He ran as Ukraine first. Trump took the old pro-Nazi slogan of America first, and you're exactly right. So it was not obvious even in the first year of Yanukovych.
So what happened when the people figured out that Yanukovych was basically dancing to Putin's tune?
Well, by the second year, it became totally obvious, and the people literally rose up. Yanukovych, on Putin's orders, was having people shot. That brought more people into the streets, and basically they ran him out of Ukraine. They overran his incredible mansion that was just full of all these Trumpian, extravagant gold and crystal and $100,000 chandeliers and all this. And Yanukovych literally had to flee to Russia. But the interesting thing is, if the Democrats had not captured the House, you could almost make a case that we are, in some ways, we are today living like Ukraine was in the first year or so under Yanukovych. In other words, the Ukrainians had a president controlled by Moscow. They didn't really realize it.
But he was doing a lot of policies that favored Moscow.
Right.
Which Trump is doing right now.
While at the same time throwing red meat to his base and claiming Ukraine first and, coming up with all these excuses until he could just no longer hide that. And in many ways, we're like that today. I mean, think about this. Everything Trump has done, from the Labor Department to the Defense Department to the Environmental Protection Agency, he's been doing exactly the opposite of what any even moderate Republican president would do. In other words, if you have somebody that had the Education Department is against public education. People that had the Environmental Protection Agency are against protecting the environment. People who run the Department of Labor are against organized labor. In other words, it's almost, if you imagine it like an Avengers-style movie where some alien has infiltrated and is having people, attack America from within. That's exactly what Trump totally appears to be doing.
Yeah, he's put arsonists in charge of the fire department.
Exactly. And he's doing that, I firmly believe the evidence shows, under the influence of Trump for the financial reasons that of Putin that go back to Trump's ties to Russia.
Well, according to Seth
going back
Abramson,
to the 80s.
it's not just Putin. I mean, he wrote an entire book about how it's also Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, it's the United Arab Emirates, it's some of the cronies of Netanyahu in Israel, that there was this conspiracy to put Trump in the White House in the first place, which is pretty mind-boggling. Did George W. Bush betray the Kurds or just his daddy?
As soon as you said that, I was about to say, and I'll research this some more later, but largely I think the Kurds were relatively treated well under Bush Jr., but, when we look at how everything, basically, apparently they were promised at some point that they were essentially going to have a homeland, right, that would be independent in all but name only in northern Iraq.
We know Joe Biden was pushing for that early in the Obama administration, by the way.
Well, and so, like I say, there are probably people in Kurdish Iraq that would say, yes, that Bush Jr. screwed them over as well. So, right, it may actually be 5 consecutive Republican presidents that have screwed over those poor people.
Amazing.
But I guess to get back to Ukraine,
sure,
what do you think the odds are that Trump may literally wind up like Yanukovych? In other words, that once Trump's clear working for Putin, and I agree with you, a lot of people like MBS and others wanted Trump as president, but I think Putin was the primary one in that. I mean, there's literally a paper trail flipping 40,475 votes in the 3 states where we know that Manafort passed the internal polling data to Putin's ally. That's what won. In other words, 40,000 Hillary supporters stayed home. 40,000 Trump supporters were so angry and ginned up to come out and vote. That's what literally gave Trump the presidency.
Right.
And so I think the more stuff that's going to come out about all these dictators, but especially about Putin, I do wonder. I don't rule out that Trump could eventually have to flee the country as people mass and overrun, Mar-a-Lago or something like that.
Well, this is, I mean, even if people don't, I mean, if enough evidence of enough crimes comes out and they implicate not just Trump, but, you've got Jared Kushner and the whole thing with MBS and Qatar, and Kushner ending up with $1 billion out of the Qatari heavily invested fund. You've got Ivanka Trump, who was nearly charged by the New York State prosecutor for real estate fraud and financial fraud. You got Don Jr. and Eric involved in a number of these frauds. It wouldn't surprise me if the entire Trump crime family flees the country.
I would say for me, and I'm curious to get your take, to me, I would say there's about a 5% chance of that happening.
I'd put it in that neighborhood. Yeah.
Okay.
It's higher than zero. It's certainly higher than zero. I mean, it's going to depend on what comes out, and it's also going to depend to a certain amount on the elections. I think, the elections are going to happen in the first week of November of next year, and then, a month later, the inauguration happens. And if in that gap, the Democrats overwhelmingly take the White House, the Senate, and the House, then that would increase the probability that the Trump crime family will flee the country because of their fear of retribution.
Now, let me ask you this, because you raise a great point there, and hopefully that will happen, to save America. But do you think Trump would try to pardon himself and his family first, or do you think he would resign, say in December after the election, having struck a deal for Pence to pardon Trump and his family?
So, Lamar, you asked me just during the last break, you asked me what I thought were the possibilities of Trump pardoning himself and his associates, the rest of the Trump crime family, versus cutting a deal like Nixon did with Jerry Ford to have Pence pardon him. The Constitution says that during a period when the president is being impeached, which has formally happened, it started 2 weeks ago, almost 2 weeks ago, that when the president is being impeached, he loses his power of pardon. So, if he were to win in the Senate if he were to win a trial, or if they couldn't get the impeachment resolution passed through the House, I suppose it's possible he would pardon himself and the rest of his family. I think it's more likely, though, if he leaves office, that it would be Pence. But that's just my thinking. What's yours?
Well, let me ask you this. What do you think the odds are will actually officially impeach Trump? I put those odds at 90 to 95% that the House will impeach Trump. Where are you at on that?
I would agree with those numbers, and the thing that makes me feel relatively emphatic about that is that Nancy Pelosi has been very, very, very careful, very methodical. She did basically, she wasn't willing to go there until she had no choice. So, yeah, I think that's real high. The question is what's going to happen in the Senate.
Well, but now let's go back to the House, because I'm saying 90-95% because a couple of different stories have been floated by Trump insiders supposedly that Trump is so paranoid about having the impeachment on his record, because even Richard Nixon, the Judiciary Committee had passed the articles, but in other words, the whole House had not
right. He was
voted.
Never officially impeached.
Right, and that Trump is so loath to have that on his record that there is a chance, I think it's only a 5 to 10% chance, that if it looks like for sure that vote is going to happen,
he'll pull a Nixon.
Well, he'll either pull a Nixon or what I see, because he's much, I don't know, he's street smart, but he's not nearly the political genius that Nixon was. Is that I think he would fake fake a heart attack, fake a medical reason to have to resign the presidency before that happens. Because my understanding is, and again, you may know better, is that if he did in fact resign before the official vote was taken, even if he resigned hours before it was taken, then it becomes kind of a moot point, so to speak.
I think he's much less worried about history. He has said on 2 different occasions he doesn't care how he's thought of by history. He'll be dead. I think he's more afraid that the impeachment inquiry will reach the point where he can no longer hide his tax returns, and we and the entire world will discover that he's been broke for at least 20 years, and he's been living off money from basically foreign mobsters. And that's what he's afraid is going to come out. And the whole House of Cards will collapse once everybody realizes that he's broke. But the thing that I really fear is that he will start World War III.
That's on my
and I put that at about
list.
20% right now.
Is that he will? So you put war at 20%. I would agree. I'd say maybe as high as 30%. But yeah, definitely in that range. As part of that, I could see him hugely overreacting to some terrorist attack or attempted attack.
Yep.
And I don't rule out that he could actually win the next election, especially, if the Senate votes not to impeach him, so he's off. He's going to say.
And if he wins, he will be unstoppable. I mean, that'll be the end of democracy in the United States.